Well, I find that image that you use of emptiness dancing actually a really potent one, and to really accept in the moment that the mystery or nothingness unfolding.
Yes.
Because my mind can't do anything with that. I've tried. It doesn't parse.
It can't touch it.
No, so you've got to just kind of let it go and actually be here and see, as you said, what's here.
Right. Yeah. Because that's what happens. At the moment we let everything go, all of a sudden, identity lets go of its obsession with mind and thought and history and feeling, even emotion, all of that, and it returns to its home ground, right? Which is emptiness, or spirit, or consciousness, call it what you will. It goes to its home ground of emptiness. And what you realize is in the home ground of emptiness that it's not true that the enlightened person knows everything. It's just the opposite. Everybody else thinks they know everything. The enlightened person is really clear that they don't know, that they can't know. That's what they're clear on. It's empty. You see what? Because you're literally in the consciousness of pure potential. And pure potential is always here, and it's always now. And that's what you're in the consciousness of. Pure potential. You see, and again, most egos, most minds are afraid of that because the mind makes conclusions that if I was in that state, if we all came into that state, if we all quit pretending to know things we don't know, it would be anarchy.
Right.
What would be my operating principle through life? How could we get to enlightenment if we didn't know the 21 stages, the total liberation, and how it's going to look? And my God, nothing would happen. Do you see how, again, the mind is terrified of the void? And yet, only when you get there, or when you realize you are the void, you realize it's just the opposite. From that place, we know exactly what we need to know when we need to know it, which is right now. We know now perfectly. But that's all we know. That's all you can know. Yeah? And don't get me wrong, I like ideas as much as the next guy. Models are kind of fun to play with. I like science, and I love studying history, and I like all of this sort of relative stuff, and in the relative world it has a certain relative importance or a relative application. And you can even like all this stuff and not get caught in it. You can even love it and know that even though you know it, even though the mind thinks it knows things, that it really doesn't.
It's funny that takes us back to the beginnings of Western philosophy, and even Socrates, who, as you know, was famous for saying that he didn't know anything.
Right.
The oracle said he was the only one who didn't know. He was the only one who acknowledged that he didn't know anything, and I wonder if he was perhaps not in the same sort of space.
From what I've read from him, I think he was in exactly this. I think he was a totally awake being, because he knows that he doesn't know. And yet he used language, right? He used language very precisely and very accurately, like a spiritual teacher, like we're doing now, right? We are using language. Socrates used language to get people's consciousness beyond language. Right? Now, for some people, it'll work. They will go beyond language. And for other people, they will sit around for centuries discussing what Socrates said and the truth or falseness of it, and then they totally miss the point.
Right.
Yeah?
The injunction of actually being present.
Now this is the interesting, this is just sort of a side point, but Socrates, among with some of the others at that time and a couple hundred years before him, the actual fathers of rationality, most of the fathers of it actually knew this. This is where they operated from. They actually operated from a place which was beyond language. And yet they used language and even invented logic as a means to get beyond language. But for the last 2,500 years or so, we've been in a trance. We've forgotten to use language to go beyond language. We use language to create more sophisticated language, which is a way of thinking that we're getting somewhere while all the time going in circles.
Do you think something positive happened in the 60s that kind of has gotten lost. I mean, when I was younger, I mean, was born in 1960, and so I sort of missed most of it except for what my brother and sister experienced in the music. But, you know, going through what I did in the 70s and 80s, there was this hollowed view of the 60s, that there was some kind of spiritual transmission that actually came to a lot of people, and that everyone was hoping that there would be some kind of generational waking up or something, and I just don't sort of see it now. It kind of disappeared. I'm wondering what happened to it.
It's a good question. Sure, it seems to, by and large point, disappeared. I mean, when I was born in 1962, so although I was alive, I wasn't really that involved, you know, except as a child. But it seems to me, when I look back and see what's happening and see the documentaries and read the books and all that, that there was something that was alive, you know, at that time, but that happens in certain times, you know, a certain shifting of consciousness is possible. So there was something that was going on there, and yet, you know, almost immediately, that even the very people who were experiencing a certain shift, a certain coming out of certain cultural trance states, as fast as they were coming out of old cultural trance states, they were making new ones, right? So, like we know, like by and large, the generation, like, you know, I hate to make generalizations, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Let's just say, like, the hippie culture was they had something that was profound, something there. They were waking up from certain parts of the cultural trance, right, which was very positive. But unfortunately, they created new trances almost as fast as you could snap your finger, that were, for most of them, not all of them, of course, but for many of them, were highly self-indulgent. Right? And so this isn't to discount, like, that there is something, some other energy coming into consciousness, some coming out of certain cultural trances. That was happening, certainly. But, you know, that can happen in somebody, but if they're not, if the ground's not really set, it goes into, that energy just creates new trances. So I think a lot of that happened. Although, you know, here we are, you know, all these years later, 30, 40 years later now, and there are people from that generation. I think it had the effect that a lot more people than before got into serious spiritual work as they aged. You know, as they hit their late 30s and 40s and 50s, they some of that spark, some of that breaking through that was happening in the 60s was still alive in them, and that's why you find so many of them involved in, you know, some form of spiritual practice or spiritual seeking, unlike their you know, their forefathers.
Are you optimistic about the internet and its impact on people's spirituality, or are most people gonna?
Well, but that's not about the internet. I'm neither optimistic nor unoptimistic about anything. Because to me, duality it's really simple. You know, it cuts both ways and equally so. And so, you know, what you guys do with the internet, it's a wonderful thing. You bring beautiful things to people, helpful things to people, and there's that, and then there's the other side. There's the whole dark and shadow side of the internet.
Right.
So it's always, that's the way duality goes. It holds as much good potential as it does bad potential. I mean, you can't have duality without it doing that. So, do I hold out hope? I'm not really a hope kind of guy. I just see that it makes things available for people who really want it. If you want shadowy material, it's totally available. If you want material, like nowadays, you can go onto a website, and even for free now, you can get the teachings that people 2 generations ago had to sacrifice their whole lives for. I mean, they literally had to leave their homes and their families, and they had to enter temples, and even then they would probably have to undergo some very serious, disciplined spiritual practice before they'd even get the more advanced teachings. I mean, their whole life had to be sacrificed. And now someone can go onto a website and go click, 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 and there's the same teachings. And that's nice for the person who's ready for it. You know, that's a nice thing that it's not all secret and have very little people in the culture know about it. It's nice that it's out in the open, And again, that cuts both ways, right? That cuts for the good if you're ready for it, and not so good if you're not ready for it. So that's like saying nothing, isn't it?
I don't know.
That's what us spiritual teachers specialize in, saying a lot and actually saying pretty much nothing.
It's great having you here.
I like being here.
Yeah.
As long as it lasts.
So when I was younger, I really used to want to be like, in Maurice Buck's book, Cosmic Consciousness, and have these, super duper phantasmagorical experiences. And I had some of them. And I also used some substances and had some of them with that. And I mean, I was really intent on becoming that kind of spiritual Superman thing.
Yeah.
But, now I'm pretty sure that's not the right way to go.
Well, that's the confusing part of all this, of spirituality, I think, which I think is starting to be cleared up a little bit very slowly as we go along, is that we mistake mystical states of consciousness for truth, for reality. Mm-hmm. When really a mystical state of consciousness, even the word we say altered state of consciousness, right?
Right.
How could truth be an altered state of consciousness? It's like a potential of consciousness. Right? Consciousness is incredibly malleable, is it not? It can go from being suicidally depressed to so blissed out you can't even function, and everything in between. Right? This amazing spectrum of how consciousness can mold itself and change itself and experience itself, and we often think, because enlightenment's been sold as an altered state of consciousness, which is highly pleasant. Right? And of course, the mystical states of consciousness are also highly addictive. You have one, and it's like a drug. Right? It's like cocaine or something. You'll sell your soul to get another one. You'll follow any idiot over the cliff to get another hit. So mystical states, they show a lot sometimes. They're interesting. They're highly addictive. They're extraordinarily pleasant. But enlightenment is what's beyond. It's not about a state of consciousness at all. It's the realization of consciousness as such, consciousness itself. That which can display itself as this amazing spectrum of states. But enlightenment is really more about the stateless. That which is not a state. It's that which isn't even an experience. Although it has byproducts, right? Mm-hmm. There's byproducts that are very pleasant. But in and of itself, the truth isn't a state. It's not an experience. Any more than the consciousness that's functioning through you right now, or looking through your eyes. It's not a state. What's looking through your eyes isn't a state. It's not really high or low or this or that. It's
just is what it is.
It is what it is, and that's part and parcel of the enlightenment, is getting your identity out of states. Which seems to be, we're getting a little closer to that overall. I like it. At least I think. I'm not so sure sometimes.
Well, we're conditioned, I want to know something.
Sure.
The conditioned mind wants to know, like sort of come to a resting place, even though it's not going to happen.
Right. Well, that's the whole point. The conditioned mind thinks its ultimate resting state will be in an ultimate state of knowing. Mm-hmm. Actually, its ultimate resting state is in a state of ultimately not knowing. Right.
But just because it's not knowing doesn't mean that. It's like the Talking Head song where they say heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. Mm-hmm. I think my mind is afraid that if it knew that it didn't know what was going on, that nothing would happen, that would be the end of everything.
That's right.
And it's probably actually the opposite of that, but you got to look.
Obviously, it's obviously the opposite, because look at all the human beings that populate the earth, and almost everyone thinks they know what's happening, and they're all totally contradictory states of knowing. And life unfolds anyway. it's not listening to what anybody thinks they know. It just, if there was no human being anywhere, it would be just fine. You know, so it's all fit and fury signifying absolutely nothing. You know what I mean?
I do.
You know, it's not necessarily, it's not knowing in the sense of stupidity. It's not so you and I sit on our couch forever and go, I don't know anything. What do you want to do? I don't know. Where do you want to go? I don't know. What do you want to eat? I don't know. It's not, it's misunderstood as that. When we really don't know, as I said, then we know exactly what we need to know at every second we need to know it. But we don't know anything else, anything more, because we can't know anything more. We know the one thing that's worth knowing, which is what everything is.
It's just funny, though, that we want a kind of security that actually stops us from experiencing the security that's actually there.
Right. Yes. There it is. Yeah, we want the security. Which is about the most unsecure thing to go around doing, isn't it? Have you noticed? The more you search for the security, the more insecure you feel.
That's right, which is why some of these people, it doesn't seem to matter how much money people have, they always want more money.
They always want more. Right. Or a spiritual practitioner. It doesn't matter how many spiritual experiences they have. They want more. The next one. The last 10 didn't lead to ultimate freedom, but I know the next one. Yeah, the one to end all others. Yeah. And it's the same trance, just at a different level. As Trungpa called it 2 decades or 3 decades ago, spiritual materialism.
Yeah, right. That was a great book.
It was a great book.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways I think it's all a lot simpler than our minds want to make it.
It's the most simple thing in the world.
Because it already is.
That's the whole thing about the ultimate reality of truth. It's the one and only thing that actually exists. What could be more simple? Here we sit. Everything about this moment is the truth. Everything about it is a manifestation, a display of truth, of ultimate reality. You know? So here we are sitting in it, surrounded by it. There actually couldn't be anything that exists that's not truth, and yet people go around looking for it. It's like a fish looking for water.
It's a very sophisticated comedy.
Very. Yes. Yes. It is kind of comedy. Yeah. That's why, I mean, from one point of view, it's not particularly comedic, and from another point of view, it's totally comedic. You know? Especially when we wake up. I mean, we just see the big laugh in it. We see the laugh of ourselves, of our own struggles, of our own confusions, of our own... It's almost unbelievable that this thing that I was looking for was always already here. Yeah.
Well, we don't want to admit it because then we go, well, I guess I wasted, 40 years looking for this thing.
But that's the whole point. Yeah. Okay, so what? That's the joke of it all.
Right.
You know? That's the joke of it all. That's the... Yeah, you're right. You know, that's... We can make that conclusion. Or we can not. You know? Fine, who cares? You're lucky. You only wasted 40 years. Good for you. That's pretty quick.
40 years and 40,000 incarnations.
And 40,000 incarnations.
You know that for a fact?
That's pretty
No, I did like that one, I forget, I think it was in True Meditation where you talked about you did have an experience of sort of seeing all of your incarnational kind of like heads leading up to where you were in that exact moment, and you could kind of look behind you and see them all.
Yeah.
Doing what they were doing all along.
Yeah, it's like looking in a room and seeing all the Halloween masks you wore over your lifetime. You know? But the thing about it, that's another thing I don't emphasize in my teaching work much because, even the words we use, past incarnations. What I saw is there isn't any past to them. They seem past and they feel past, but they're not because it's not possible to have past. They're all now. It's like if you had a dream last night. Just imagine you had a dream, and in your dream part of your dream was that you spiritually woke up, okay? And then as you were waking up, you remembered 1,000 past lifetimes. So there you are, laying in your bed, having a dream that you woke up and you remembered 1,000 past lifetimes, right? And then you wake up and you're laying in bed. And you realize, wow, that was fun. But then you realize, wait a minute, I dreamed 1,000 past lifetimes up in the present moment. You see, there wasn't actually any past to them. I dreamed them up right as they were happening. And this is what we call past lives. They're actually all simultaneously created right now, like everything else. In other words, time is an illusion, but, as a spiritual teaching, it's not really useful. Statements of reality aren't really useful.
Including the one you just made, right?
Especially the one I just made. Right. In fact, that one could probably do more to get in the way of awakening because people would sit around thinking about it.
So, the underlying advice I hear you offering people is to actually check out what's real now.
Right.
See, just inquire, just see. Just
look for yourself and get simple. Get really simple. Don't make it complicated. Like anybody can look and say, you can start wherever you want, right? Anything you think is true. Do I know it's true? Would I bet the farm on it? Would I bet my life? If I even shaded the truth a little bit, if I thought to myself, I'm about 99.9% it's true, so I'll say it's true. It means, but you missed it by 0.1%. If that 0.1% that you missed it meant you'd spend eternity in tormented hell, how sure are you of what you are now? See, if you just imagine consequences like that, not that they'll happen, of course, but then you see, wait a minute, what do I really know? You want to get quiet. Everything will go quiet inside. Everything goes quiet. And if you take it personally, what do I know about me? What do I know? Do I know I'm that thought? Do I know I'm that feeling? Do I know? See, what's awake to all this? And again, you notice when I speak these questions, I'm not giving answers. The questions are meant to create gaps in the conditioned consciousness, conditioned mind. That's the heart of spirituality, creating gaps in conditioned mind so that that moment of seeing comes through.
Do you have anything else?
I don't think so. we can go on.
Kind of ruined that. Interview, didn't I?
That was a really big gap.
Says it all.
I knew we'd get to this point.
Sorry, guys.
It's a good thing you didn't say that at the beginning.
Yeah. We almost did. Good Lord.
Well, we'd like to thank you very much for your time. I thought this was great.
You're welcome.
It was a lot of fun, and I don't have anything else to say.
I enjoyed both of you. Yeah, really did. You guys are fun.
This is December
Question?
11th?
11th? I'll be done. Okay.
Lucky 11th of December, and we're here in San Jose.
Last I knew, yeah.
We're in San Jose, California, with Adyashanti and Jeremy Hale and Jordan Gruber and
Patty Batari.
And Patty's in the background holding the space for us. And this is an enlightenment.com interview. And I thought we would just start by saying hi and thanking you for giving us the time to speak with you.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate it. And let you know that we're both very excited about this talk because your work speaks to both of us very deeply right where we are in the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Ever since Jordan got two of your latest books, and one was the True Meditation, and I got True Meditation and read it, and then downloaded the CDs into my iTunes and put it on my iPod and listened to it in the car, and it's so much. I've told Jordan before that I saw you also at East West one time, and it was a great experience because what was going on for me at that particular time was sort of not being able to kind of settle with the work, the internal work that I was doing and the sitting and the results that I was getting, and having that be okay and just moving through that kind of territory. And at that particular talk, you had made the statement about that just to do your practice and allow your practice to permeate into your being, something along those lines. And so on a number of occasions, I have felt as if you were me articulating things that I was struggling to articulate and formulate in my mind to, and then all of a sudden I hear this and I went, that's it.
Yeah,
that's it. And
well, that's one of the primary jobs of a teacher, really.
Yeah,
is to sort of speak things that resonate with people that they already know is true.
Yes,
it may or may not be conscious for them, but when they hear it, I think we all have a certain recognition of what's true.
Yeah, or
certainly at the very least, what speaks to us.
Yeah, what's
important for us at that moment.
Yeah. Well, so I've been doing the meditation on the two meditations that you talked about in the True Meditation book, and enjoying them a lot. And I have a question for you. In the first one, in the allowing and just sort of allowing and getting out of the way and losing the meditator and letting go of all that manipulation, is such a great. I don't know what the word is, the description of that process. And the other thing is that you being a Westerner, you speak in a common language as opposed to years and years of like reading books and going to meditation retreats with East Indian gurus and stuff. They don't always speak our language, and it was always trying to kind of like, well, okay, these guys were
Yeah, we're often in a stance of constant trying to translate one language into another language.
Yeah,
makes it much more difficult.
Yeah. Well, so the thing that keeps coming up for me is two things, and one is that there's this commentator that's always going on. I call him the man with no mouth, because he doesn't have a body, and it's just kind of like and it's as if it's a thought. And I'm curious about that because it seems to me that this is just another thought, and it has nothing to do with who I am.
Yeah.
And yet there's this commentator. It's very difficult to get rid of that guy.
Well, that's the problem. Is as soon as you try to get rid of it, and in other words, it's the commentator that's trying to get rid of the commentator. That's the trickiness of it. So the commentator functions at lots of levels, right? Some of the commentary is sort of obviously ridiculous, almost ludicrous, and then some of the commentary pretends to be very sort of sophisticated, or maybe your ally. So part of the commentator becomes, how do I get rid of the commentator? Which is it's actually more commentary. And so that's what we find is that the different patterns of mind get very, very subtle and very, very much they hook into whatever our conditioning is, so that some of the commentator will take as obviously not real, almost just like a disembodied, babbling, ridiculous movement of thought, and then other parts of the commentator are so hooked into what we think is wise and intelligent and necessary that we'll take it to be as true. Yeah. So as soon as as there's the conclusion that commentary that says, hey, I got to get rid of the commentator, as soon as we think that's true, then we're hooked again.
Right. We're doing the same thing on another level.
It's just on another level, right. It's on a much more subtle or, in many ways, more deceptive level. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really the heart, and it goes through almost all spiritual practices, is that maybe in more modern language they would call it the superego, or the I think it's the superego. I don't really know what they would call it for sure, but it's that part of the mind or ego that imitates as some of our highest intelligence when it's actually not. It's that which says, I need to get rid of this thought pattern that's annoying, or I must, here this is the strategy I'm going to use to get rid of this conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
But those thoughts are themselves conditioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it runs almost through the whole spectrum of spirituality as this sort of very subtle imposter.
Mm-hmm.
Or the thought that I must do something. I
Yes.
can't just, that old joke about just sit there and don't do anything. I find that very hard. I want to do something. I mean, I've spent my whole life training to do something to be rewarded, and the idea of just letting that go, I find difficult.
Yeah. Well, like you said, that we're conditioned, that we get places by doing things. In other words, using the personal will to get what we want. Right? And then we take it into spirituality. On the face of it, if we actually just backed up a few steps and looked at it, it would be seen as totally ludicrous. Because the heart of spirituality is getting beyond the personal self. And yet, it's so easy to get hooked into the personal self that says, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. And so instead of telling the personal self or placing another demand on it, which would be, okay, now what I'm supposed to do or going to do is I'm going to allow everything to be. And what you find is your mind actually has no interest in that whatsoever.
Right.
And you can't do it because by the very nature of it, it's not a doing, is it?
No.
Right. You can't, there is no such thing necessarily as a practice of allowing everything to be, because as soon as you try to do it,
Right.
You're not doing it.
If you practice it, you negate the practice.
Exactly. That's why I turn it. I like to switch it. And instead of making it something that one is trying to do, I turn it into a question. What happens, or what is happening, when I allow everything to be? Then the focus of the mind is on what happens, or what is happening, and it's not about trying to change experience. So as soon as you turn it into a question, what happens when I allow everything to be? In the question itself, there's actually allowing, is already starting to happen. And the mind, which is really curious by nature, right? It wants to know, it wants to investigate. That's the kind of tool it is. It's sort of happy because it's on this,
It's got something to do.
Yeah, it's got something to do. It's on this quest of investigation, and it's using its own intelligence, and it's connected with its own experience. And so you're sitting there silently with sort of this background inquiry: what happens when I allow everything to be? What's happening? What happens to this thought when I allow it to be? Instead of, my practice is to allow it to be. See, that's a totally different paradigm. It's a different way of viewing it, which sets up an internal conflict. I'm trying to allow it to be, and yet I can't do that. My very effort to do it means that I can't actually accomplish it. It sets up a conflict. Whereas you turn it, what happens, and all of a sudden the conflict is gone. As long as you don't try to answer the question in your mind.
Right.
So that's one thing that a lot of people about spirituality don't understand, is they hear certain spiritual questions or inquiries, but they think that those inquiries are meant to get nice answers to. Just like if you go to school, you're taught, study hard, learn the answers, take the test, get an A, get a pat on the back. Spirituality is sort of very different. The questions aren't meant to get answers. They're meant to create a gap in the mind so that you can actually feel and enter into your own experience. So what happens when I allow everything to be as it is? You actually feel it with your body, with your senses. There's no answering. Anybody that comes back with a nice answer has actually missed the whole point, They've given the wrong answer, actually. Their body is giving them the real answer.
See, this is the problem with talking with you about stuff, is I just want to be here and not talk.
Good. Well, we're accomplishing the task.
Yeah, the thing that I experience, I forget every single day. I remember every day, and I forget every single day. And when I forget, it's as if I'm a robot, and I'm going along until all of a sudden I go, wait a minute, what am I doing? It's like, I'm forgetting. I forgot. Oh my God! I just went off on this trip.
Yeah.
You know, this complete. I made the whole thing up. It's a fantasy. It's as if I'm writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
You know, or somebody's writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's conditioned thought or whatever. And then I remember, and I get a little gap, and there's, you know, and so I guess my question is that how do I make those memories? How do I remember more often and make those?
Good question. Good question. Here's what I would say. First thing, again, we have just recognize the nature of what's actually happening. The nature of experience is, there you are, like you said, you've just gone off into some conditioned pattern. It might be for a minute, an hour, it might be for a week.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, or you might be meditating, and you realize, I've been thinking about yesterday's breakfast for the last 15 minutes. And so all of a sudden, literally out of nowhere, there is a recognition of what's been happening. So you come out of the trance of thought. The key is you came out of the trance of thought totally spontaneously, correct? Mm-hmm. You just came out. Mm-hmm. Whether you're walking around in your daily life or you're meditating, all of a sudden, you just came out. Now, this is where the problem gets created, because the mind goes, how did I do that? And how do I make sure that happens more often? How do I come out of my trances more often? Which, that conclusion is itself the next trance. Mm-hmm. You see, because it's dismissing the reality of the situation is that you came out totally spontaneously. Mm. And as soon as the mind starts to wonder, how did I do that, and how do I do that more in the future, you're actually buying into it's what I call an intelligent trance. Right? Yeah. It seems smart. It seems like a good question. It appears to be something that would be very necessary to answer. But this is what I tell people, like if people are meditating, let's say, and they come out of a trance, the first thing to do is just to just appreciate it. Have a moment of gratitude. It's almost like, wow, thank you. Out of nowhere, I came out of this trance. In fact, the nature of awareness is to come out of the trance. The nature of what is obviously to come out of trance, because it keeps coming out of trance. But the mind immediately takes credit for it and puts it back into another trance. So I found it can be really powerful if there's just a gap when you feel, I recognize I've been thinking about yesterday's breakfast for the last 20 minutes. And, I'm not doing that anymore. And a moment of, it sounds sort of cliche, but almost a moment of gratitude, or a moment of recognizing that you've been graced in some way.
Grace is a good word.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is what I found. As soon as we give acknowledgement to reality, to what's actually happening, acknowledgement to grace, it tends to happen a lot more often. Mm. As soon as we start discounting it, and the mind says, what can I do? It's a way of sort of a very subtle form of spiritual arrogance.
Right.
You know?
And grace doesn't need me.
Yeah. Right. It'll still work. I mean, you'll still come out of the trance at some point, you know. But many, many spiritual practitioners get caught in this trap for decades. And they never notice, you know, that, wait a minute, I'm not coming out of my trances because I'm making myself come out. I'm just coming out. The nature of awareness is not to be lost indefinitely. Yeah?
Yeah.
So to me, it's one of these, it's almost like a very subtle form of a spiritual practice, like appreciation, that you came out. Mm-hmm. And it's very subtle and it's soft, and the ego can't manipulate it or do much with it. Mm. That's why it's usually not very interested in it. Mm. But when one starts to do that, it's very powerful. Mm. You notice these gaps come much more often. Because it's conditioning again, right? Mm-hmm. If every time you come out of a trance, let's say you're meditating, and every time you realize that you've been thinking for the last 5 minutes, you get upset with yourself, or some minor conflict, it's like you're conditioning your body that to come out of a trance is a negative experience. Right? Mm-hmm. Every time I come out of the trance, I'm going to be hard on myself, I'm going to condemn myself, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen. And so we all know that what we condition in ourselves tends to keep happening, right? So if you condition yourself that coming out of a trance is a negative thing, you won't come out near as often. If you start to condition yourself that coming out of a trance is a positive thing, then your body and your mind and your psychology and your emotions are going to be much more
so this is a
conditioned
glass
to have it happen.
half full thing, not a glass half empty thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a glass totally full in a sense. Because when you really see it, you realize, God, my mind left to its own could have literally thought this trance forever until the grave. How the hell did I come out of this trance? How did that happen? It seems that everything's hooked up to never come out, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, that's really grace, and that's interesting that you said that, because it's like that first moment in I can only really speak for myself, but I could also sometimes I go, well, my name is really Everyman.
Yes.
But
that's true for all of us.
Yes, for sure. But for myself, it was like a moment when I first recognized that there was something more and deeper. Yeah. But up until that point, no way. It's like, no. I'm over here. I'm playing football, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that, and none of that stuff existed for me until one day something happened. I didn't really do anything. I opened up a book, but something spoke to me, and it changed everything.
Yeah. Yeah, even the smallest glimpse beyond the veil has a huge impact. It's really quite powerful. Yeah.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about you being a teacher of spirituality and meditation. And this word transmission has been in my mind because you talk in Emptiness Dancing about how many things can have a transmission, this cup or a book, but when someone meets with a teacher or hears their voices, as some people may hear us speaking right now, something seems to happen. And the kind of the pun metaphor that came to my mind was that it's like you have a transmission that's in gear, so you can go to where you want to go. And when my transmission, which is kind of stuck, experiences that, you use words like harmonization and resonance. It seems that by being with someone who forgets less and who is more in gear, that just by touching them, whether it's physically or energetically or through voice, that people are able to advance is the wrong word, but are able to be more of who they are by seeing someone else who is experiencing themselves more consciously being who they are. So how does that really work? And do people need a teacher? Does it help?
Well, I can't make a definite statement about whether people need a teacher. Some do. Maybe most do, and some don't. You can't make any blanket statement. You can find exceptions to the rule. Therefore, the rules aren't really very consistent. So, as far as a teacher goes, but the transmission part is, it's really, it's the whole reason for the teacher, actually. But I like to demystify it a bit, and like you said, we all are transmitting our state of consciousness at all times. Everybody's doing that. You walk in the room with someone who's extraordinarily depressed, even if you don't look at them. If you're sensitive, you can feel it in the room, can't you?
Right.
Or someone who's joyous, you can feel it. And it's actually resonating with that potential within you, and then it manifests, and it sort of wakes it up in you, right? It's not necessarily that you're receiving something from another as much as it's waking up the same potential in you. And so this happens with everybody, but it also happens with spiritual teachers. And so when we're in a state of, when one's in a state of consciousness, we could say, of awakeness, that resonates. It's like a field, right? It's a field of consciousness, and then it's sort of, people, given their openness, will resonate with that field. And it can temporarily lift them up a little higher, metaphorically speaking, lift them up, or lift them up entirely into that field so they're sharing of that state of consciousness. So in one sense, this is underlying the words and ideas and all of that. It's one of the teacher's main functions. Having said that, it's also important to realize that I think most spiritual practitioners have the experience that they may come around a teacher, or just anybody who is really spiritually awake. Anybody. It could be your grandmother. Could be your next door neighbor. Who knows? But although you can come up a little bit or experience that state of consciousness to some extent when you're in the presence, then you leave. Then you go out of the spiritual gathering or whatever it is, and then you tend to go back to where you were, right? People experience that all the time. They kind of go back to their norm. But now their system also has a certain sort of kinesthetic memory. It's sensed something else, and that actually can act as a catalyst. But it's a very, it's one of those delicate areas that I don't tend to talk a lot about. I do occasionally. I don't put a lot of emphasis because if you do, then what happens is spiritual seekers run around trying to get hits off of all the spiritual teachers, which is a great way not to wake up. It's a great way to get sort of addicted to the high that you can get in spiritual circles. It's a very. It's high. I always say, all of it. We should come with a label on our forehead that says "Caution may be highly addictive." So it's both a blessing and a curse, I guess.
Well, and that would seem to be especially true for teachers who specialize in cities and synchronicities and powers, and people come near them and they flash into these intense states, and there's a lot of that goes on.
Yeah.
And so another question I have is,
which is very different, by the way. It can be very different from the state of awakened consciousness.
Right.
You can have them both together, but you can also have tremendous powers, energetic influences, Shakti, all of that. You can have unbelievable amounts of that and not actually be spiritually awake.
Right.
So those are often, or you can be awake and have those. But I find that for people it's really important that they don't equate one with the other, because they've often been linked together, and which causes a lot of confusion.
Well, part of the problem seems to be that spiritual teachers, especially in this country, when they get to a certain level of fame, a lot of them seem to go wrong.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of scandals, whether it's
Yeah.
sex or money or just abusing power over their teachers and all that stuff. We have a close friend who said, "Oh, you're going to see Adyashanti. He's great. He's early in his career. He's pure, and
he's not totally corrupt."
That's what he said. So how are you going to avoid it? It seems to happen to everybody.
Well, it doesn't happen.
Don't
to
buy
everybody.
your own press.
Yeah. No.
Don't believe.
Well, that's it, really. That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
It does happen to a lot, but of course, it's like everything else we hear in the media. We hear about the people who fall, and we don't hear about the 8 out of 10 people who don't.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's not to dismiss what you said at all. Look, it's the same thing everywhere, right? The tendency of power is to corrupt. The tendency of authority is to corrupt. That's its tendency. And I think the problem or the mistake that often gets made in spirituality is what comes along with the awakened state of consciousness. There's a certain sense of freedom, obviously, but there's also a certain sense of confidence or conviction. And this is, it's a wonderful thing about the sort of awakened consciousness, but it's also a very dangerous thing about it. And if you don't recognize both sides of it, everything has two potentials, right? Everything has two potentials. And the awakened state has the potential that whatever is still being worked out in one's unconscious or in one's personality structure or whatever, is that awakened consciousness. It's very easy to conclude, because there's awakeness here, or someone might say, because I'm awake, then everything I think is true. Right? They won't say that consciously, but one can feel that. Because awakeness is here, then what I think is true, my conclusions are true, what I feel is actually true. And I find that this is sort of it's innocent, but it is the beginning of the illusion. Is that just because you're awake doesn't mean that what you think is any more true than what somebody that's totally unawake think. It doesn't mean that at all. Just because you're awake doesn't mean that you get a pass on never being tempted by certain emotions or feelings or thoughts or things like. Just because you're awake doesn't necessarily mean that you can go asleep to all that. See what I mean? And that's what I find. Sometimes when people get awake, they go asleep to certain things because they start to assume. Like, of course, I mean, the nature of spiritual awakening is one feels like you'll be awake forever. That's the nature of it. When you're in that state, it seems incorruptible. And ultimately, it is incorruptible. But you're not. You see what I mean? As a human being. So it's very, very easy to forget that. Very, very easy. And as you just said too, it's easy to start to believe your own press. You know. And to me personally, it's a part of this whole teaching thing that's most surreal to me. It's a very the more popular you get, the more unreal the environment gets around you, because you start to be viewed as sort of a spiritual commodity that people are really interested in.
Yeah.
And if you're not, you may have a tendency to start to believe what people believe about you, and it's really dangerous.
People project holiness or deity into the teacher and think that if they can get a little touch, a little snippet, they'll be saved somehow.
Yeah.
They project it totally out of themselves. And
Exactly.
I mean, there's one teacher who I won't mention by name who's very popular now, and I saw him in San Francisco, and it was a huge church, and it was full. And when he finally came out, everybody was hushed, and it was, I always wonder if we were around when Jesus or Buddha were around, if they would be really different, so holy that we would just drop to our knees, praying and crying and awe and terror. They'd kind of be normal people.
I don't think that people. I don't think people were any different 2,000 years ago than they are today. Yeah. And I don't think the teachers that were around 2,000 years ago were any different than they are today. I think people are pretty much, people are pretty much people. I don't imagine Buddha went around, or Jesus, with a great halo that was so bright that nobody could stand to look at them, except with sunglasses on. That's why that a lot of the people that we view that way, most of them are dead.
Right.
You see, because you can put any projection you want on a dead guy.
And the ones that aren't dead have a really big circus going on around them, and so the actual teaching gets lost.
It's very easy for it to get lost.
It's the celebrity thing, it's that a strange thing of certainly Western people, of like that fan mentality of like,
people in general. I mean, you go to India, it's almost even worse. Yeah. What they'll do with their gurus, but we do it here too. It is a celebrity thing. We forget that the truth isn't. It's not about the person. It's just not about the person. It's not about an enlightened person. It's about enlightenment. And then we keep thinking in terms, or want to put it in terms of enlightened person, an enlightened personality, and all of that. And that's diluted in the extreme. And yet, that's what runs most of spirituality.
So you're really special, and if I do what you've done, then I can be really special too.
Right. So therefore, here's what if you want to do that, let's just pretend. Here's what you need to do. You need to literally fail at everything you ever tried spiritually.
We've already done that.
You need to fail totally. You have to fail at meditating well. You have to fail, and at certain times in your life, you have to fail so tremendously and traumatically that you won't be able to hide your failure from anybody or anything. You've got to completely lose your face, not only to yourself, but everybody around you. You've got to screw up absolutely, thoroughly, and royally. If you want to follow the path that I took, that's the path. That's the royal road to enlightenment. I don't think many people would want to sign up for the way it worked. That's why I always say my spiritual path was a path of failure.
In a way, isn't that the same for everyone? And I think it's, in my own experience, failure is the only thing that sort of has,
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
I know we don't tend to get more conscious because of our great successes and our great thoughts and our great conclusions. It's because we fall on our face. Yeah. And this doesn't work, or that doesn't work, or that falls apart, or that degenerates or disappears. That's the path of awakening. That's why I say to people, the path of awakening can be a bloody mess. And if you think it's just about, halos and being blissed out, think again or find something else to do.
I like your story in the biography. I mean, at the end of Emptiness Dancing that Tammy Simon did with you, which I found really enjoyable, and you talked about how you got sick a couple of times after being this bicycle athlete.
Yeah.
And then eventually you just kind of gave up and you let go of that whole need to do whatever that was about.
It was about persona. It was about being somebody. If you're
a goal.
A goal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not only being a competitive athlete and goals, but it's also much more, at least to me at that time, many, many years ago, it was about being seen as the athlete. And if physically, I was about the most physically strong person I knew, for as much as a little 5'8" endurance athlete could be. But nonetheless, the ego wraps around that and makes it into a person. And for me, it would have been really nice to say, I meditated and through my spiritual practice and discipline, it all just melted away quite easily and effortlessly, and I let go of it. For some people, it may work out that way occasionally. No, for me, it took being put in bed for 6 months on 2 different occasions so that I could literally have it squeezed out of my system like you'd squeeze water out of a sponge until I was so physically weak that the personality couldn't congeal itself around that image. And what did I do after the first time I got sick and that got crushed? Hell, a year later I built it all back up again. So I got sick again. That's why I say, it's the spiritual path of defeat. But that the second time I got the mess, I really got it. Something got it, and realized the absolute joy and the freedom of not being anybody, of not being able to project being somebody or something, not only in my own mind, but for people around me. It sort of just crushed that desire out of my system, so that it just wasn't. There was nothing in me that wanted to do it. It just wasn't. It just wasn't fun, and it's still to this day. I find that having seen that and having had that desire to be somebody, sort of, squeezed out of my system through those illnesses, has come in very handy as a spiritual teacher, as we were talking earlier. As you get more well known, or the adulation you get, or whatever, I found that there is no taste in me for being somebody for somebody else. I am who I am. Take it or leave it. That's what I see the spiritual teacher's job is just to be themselves, not to be phony.
You talked about the ego goes away, but not personality. I mean, do you have the experience of kind of consciousness itself kind of running you or through you and not being you? I mean, you're still experiencing you as being you.
Well, I don't experience. How about if I said I don't experience me being you, me being me?
Okay, I'm confused.
Okay, so the personality structure, right?
Yeah.
The person that has this preference or likes to do this, or was born in Northern California and grew up in the suburban neighborhood and has that particular upbringing with that particular conditioning and genetics and all of that, that the identity isn't in that. It's sort of like when you put on a costume at Halloween. You put on a Batman costume when you play the part, but if you're sane, you don't actually start to believe you're Batman. For most human beings, they have this costume on called their me costume, who they appear to be, personality structure, psychological structure, emotional makeup, predispositions, all of that. And then the trance is, consciousness goes into a trance, crystallizes around that, and from that point on, then that's where your identity is. And so it's like putting on a Halloween mask at birth or just after birth and actually believing that you are the mask. And part of awakening is, in the most simple description, is identity actually shifts out of that back to its natural state. Whatever you want to call that. Consciousness, spirit, Buddha nature. But that's then where, if we can even call it identity, it doesn't even feel like identity, but that's, if you can see it that way, that it goes there. And then and it's not mixed up with the personality structure. But there's still a personality, right?
So you still want to do things and accomplish things. I mean, you wanted to write your book, you want to teach more people.
No, that's not really the way I operate, no. No. The way, no. To tell you the truth, there's not a whole hell of a lot I want to do.
So did leprechauns write the book? You got up in the morning and it was all done for you? And...
Close to that. Yeah, close to that. I gave the talks, and a book came out of the talks.
Yeah.
And really the way I operate, and I'm not saying that this is the way it should, but it's just the way I operate, is if I look inside and say, what do I want to do, there's really almost never anything there. And so it's not like I sit down and I go, I want to write a book, because then there's no way I can do it. Because the personal will it just won't do much. It just won't, that's not where it's operating from. So usually for me, things, as sort of unspiritual as this sound, it comes from the outside, not from the inside. I don't get like, I want to make a book, I want to go travel here, I have a vision, I want to spread my teaching. That doesn't happen in me. For me, it comes from what we would call the outside. To me, it's the inside, because it's all the inside. But conventionally speaking, it would come from the outside. Someone says, you want to go here? Okay. Gee, I'd love to have a book out about da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay. So it comes from the outside, actually. So it doesn't come from, I don't usually sit around getting ideas like, this is what I want to do, this isn't what I want to do. I want to go in this direction.
So as the kind of reducto ad absurdum on this, if too many people became enlightened, would nobody would want to do anything?
No.
Civilization come to an end?
Actually, no, because this isn't necessarily indicative of being enlightened, actually. I mean, it's a whole sort of deeper subject, but it has to do with the way that we are individually hooked up. So it is possible to be enlightened and to also be sort of visionary, to sort of have a sense, like you could be enlightened, have a sense of, I want to take this message to blah, 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 or over here, or you just sort of feel I'm guided to go to Germany and teach or something. So the fact that I don't operate that way doesn't necessarily have so much to do with enlightenment as it has to do with that's the way I'm hooked up, and enlightenment just made it worse. In other words, the way we're hooked up gets more free. So since that's the way I was hooked up, that's become much more free as the sort of the personal will fell out of it. There isn't, if you don't have this makeup inside that's sort of visionary like that, if you're not, then you operate in a different way. If you are, then you operate in that way. So that's the whole difficulty with enlightenment, is we confuse it with how it operates through given makeups, right? Given structures, human structures, the way humans are designed, how they're put together. And they're put together in very different ways. And we keep mistaking that the way enlightenment functions, which is an indication of how that structure is put together, we look at that and we go, that's the way it should be. That's the way, over there, that's the way it should be. Over there, that's the way it should be. But when you get an understanding of what enlightenment's all about, and you have an understanding of basic structures of human beings and that they're different, you realize it doesn't make any sense that it would all function the same way. That would, number one, it would just be a bore, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. Right? So it's very hard to talk about this is the way enlightened beings move in the world, and this is what moves them, and this is what they all want to do, because it just doesn't work that way.
So when you said that it's all, you experience it as all being on the inside?
Yeah.
What is, I mean, are you experiencing the me that is talking to you is actually being you talking to you? Kind of seeing it from a higher level frame?
I hate using words like higher level.
broader level.
Yeah, I guess you could say more like broader level, I suppose. It's just like, in other words, from the standpoint of consciousness, everything is on the inside of it. Mm-hmm. There isn't an outside of it. Everything is on the inside. That's the experience. I can't make that. I can't have that make sense conceptually necessarily, because the conceptual framework that's trying to make sense of it, that's on the inside of it too. Mm-hmm. See what I mean? So the experience, it's not necessarily like a philosophy or a theology, it's more just a quality of experience, that everything is on the inside. Mm-hmm.
When we talk about our Western common sense, really holds that you're a separate being from me and separate from Jeremy.
Yeah.
And that we're actually distinct. No matter what you're saying to me right now, no matter books I've read and whatever I've done, I actually know that you're kind of really out there and really different.
Sure.
But what you and others who have experienced what you have in a stable way are saying that's actually, it's backwards, it's wrong.
Well, no, it's not wrong. And it's just not complete. Because there is, it would be, on the other hand, it's also true that I, as a human being, right? We could go to the totally non-dual place where that disappears, where I am all beings. But it's not one or the other. That's another misconception. Mm-hmm. And then enlightenment is being in that state where all is one, where there's no distinction, there's no separation, everything's just one unified wholeness. And that is true. But that's not all you experience from the enlightened view. If it is, it's not totally enlightened. It's not totally complete. That is it, and simultaneously, there's the other part, that things obviously appear as separate. Right? This body appears different than that one. Distinct, right? And unique. Totally unique. One face is not exactly like another face. Right? So there's still distinction, there's uniqueness, and there's the appearance of separateness. All of that is still from a certain, is still available. You see, you don't lose that. It's just that you get the other half of the picture. That even though it appears that way, everything is actually whole and one and the same. Appearing as many different things in different people.
And get hooked back into that for a moment, or?
No. Because, how can I say it? You see, because the wholeness doesn't forget. Only the relative element, the human element, it gets it, oh, I got it, or it forgets it. Yeah. And so people go, in part of their own evolution, they experience that. Right? Yeah. Oh, they're not in the trance, and then they're in the trance. Or they recognize oneness, and then they lose it, and they go back and forth. And that's still, even though it's when you have a recognition of what's outside of the trance, and that everything is actually one, it's very significant, and it's very beautiful, and it does transform that person. Mm-hmm. And certainly not only transforms them in the moment, but begins an even deeper process of transformation. So there's that, I got it and I lost it. Mm-hmm. But that is still happening within the relative experience, right? Mm-hmm. It's still, to some extent, in the experience of, there's still some separation in it. Mm-hmm. And there's something else than I got it and I lost it. You see, because that experience happens within spirit. That's the bigger context. And that, to me, is what awakening is really all about. It's not really going from I'm bound to I'm free. Because I'm free only makes sense in the presence of its relative opposite. I'm bound. Mm-hmm. But there's something else in which both I'm bound and I'm free happen within. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't wake up. That doesn't go to sleep. Mm-hmm. That doesn't get it. That doesn't lose it. It's of a different paradigm. Mm-hmm. That's why in real awakening you recognize it's the recognition of what was never really asleep. You know. I guess you'd say. Yeah.
And that's where your whole true meditation kind of book and technique comes from. Could you talk a little bit about that effort piece and being vivid and because I don't hear you saying people shouldn't have a practice or a meditation practice.
No,
I think find one that
I
works.
think people should do what they're attracted to, because they will anyway. Right? Again, what's useful for people is to really connect in with themselves instead of even not even starting with a concept. Do I need practice or not? Do I need teachers or not? It's just an idea. That's a way of going unconscious. Just get a little more quiet than that, and connect with something that's not conditioned. It's not what your mind thinks. Let yourself not know for a while. Right? Let yourself be bewildered a little bit, because most people, when they look at it, they really realize how little they actually do know. And that's the starting point. So, and if someone is sort of naturally called for silence, to be in silence, to just be, that's really what meditation is. It's just simply really meditation is the art of enjoying silence. It's the art of doing nothing, is really what meditation is. And as I see meditation right from the beginning, it's so important not to reinforce the meditator, because then you're trying to get out of the trance state through reinforcing the trance state, which just doesn't make any sense.
Can't work.
Right. And since the very heart of the ego structure is its personal will, its will to control and manipulate. And what do most people do when they sit down to meditate? They know what they want to happen, they know what they want it to feel like, and they know where they're going, which means they're all hooked up from the very first breath to control and manipulate, right?
And they know they got a half hour to do it.
And I got a half hour to get it all done. Right. That's why I say is you just take it, reverse the process. Just reverse the process and just realize this isn't about the meditator who wants to do it correctly. That's just a conditioned thought. Turn it around. If you're going to have an intention, have the intention to notice when you're manipulating, to notice when the mind controls, to notice when you're trying to manufacture an experience other than what's happening. And in the noticing of it, there can be the letting go of it. Right? Again, the question, what happens when I let go of control?
Find out, right?
Yeah. But the ego's afraid of it, isn't it?
Terribly.
I mean, it might be intrigued as the idea, but then you sit down and then you feel the insecurity. The ego says, well, how do I know that anything will happen? What if nothing happens if I sit down and let everything be? You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Everything that I've been taught will tell me that nothing happens if I don't do it. You see? And so right away, a lot of people will sort of hit the insecurities that are in the ego structure. That the ego is actually very afraid of letting go of its control, of its will, because it really is hooked up to believe that if I do, nothing positive will happen. That's why I turn it into a question, is what happens, so that you start to see what happens when you let go of control, of manipulation. Or one of the things that I have people do when they meditate, the very first time they sit down, you just sit like we're sitting in chairs right now, right? If we weren't to readjust our position or get into a meditative posture or even a meditative state of mind, and if we were just to ask ourselves, is it true that the peace and the silence and the stillness that I'm just about to try to attain through my practice, is it true that it's not already here? And you see, you can feel the presence of those things that you would want in meditation already. It's already there. So there's the art of appreciation again, right? The art of giving recognition. Oh, everything I'm just about to seek is already here. Giving recognition to it, not just intellectually, but almost physically, kinesthetically. That's the practice. Because otherwise, we start off on this assumption that the stillness and silence and peace isn't here, and I've got to go find it. So you've actually started off by denying the very thing you're looking for, and then you wonder why you can't find it. It's insane, isn't it? Right. That's why I'm always trying to turn things around so that they reconnect us with reality instead of trying to get to reality by asking a question. Is it true that it's not here? And then you say, oh, it is. And then, okay, appreciate it.
I find the hardest thing to do is to just stay in that appreciation, because my mind then wants to evaluate or judge or hold on to it or find out how to do it again or make something else happen. Just actually being it.
Yes. Yeah, because you can't do that. You see what I mean? You, as your identity that's in the mind, you are the one that's always trying to make things happen. Trying to get somewhere, trying to attain something, trying to manipulate something. You as an idea, not as you truly are. So as long as our identity is caught within the structure of mind, psychology, and emotion, then we're in trouble, right? It's difficult. That's why, to me, the underlying spiritual question, the thing that underlines all structures of spirituality is really, what is it that's doing it? So I'm meditating. Who is it that's meditating? I want to be enlightened. What is it? Who or what are you that wants to be enlightened? If you don't know that, how can you even know that your effort to be enlightenment has any basis on which to stand? You see what I mean? I mean, this is how my own spiritual life unfolded. Nobody taught me this, but one day I just thought that after years of meditating to become enlightened. I thought, I don't even know who I am. I mean, this is way before these kind of questions were part of almost the common spiritual lexicon that, you can find them very easily now. But, 20 years ago it wasn't that way necessarily. And I just thought, how do I even know if my whole spiritual pursuit is valid if I don't even know who's on it? Who wants it? What does it matter how well I'm doing at meditating if I don't even know who I am that's sitting on this damn cushion? So these questions started to rise, and the questions started to pull consciousness down to a more root level so that I was not so much interested in what I was doing, but I got interested in who I was that was supposedly doing it. And this sort of root spiritual inquiry of really what am I is it's very necessary that this informs in some way, through some means, our pursuit of truth. Because otherwise it's just being run by the imaginary self.
The reality is, though, that you did the work to find out that what you were doing wasn't working. I mean, this just didn't happen to you by total chance. I mean, you were into it.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe you were into it in a way that wasn't going to work. I think you said in the book that you had kind of almost a very martial stance towards meditating. You're going to meditate yourself into enlightenment.
Oh, yeah. I was meditating the same way that I was bicycle racing when I was young. I'll just out-train everybody. I'll outwork everybody. I'll become better as a bicycle racer because I'll just out-train you. I'll outwork you, which is what I did. And I thought that would work in spirituality. It's just the opposite. It doesn't work at all.
So we have millions of people in the United States alone who've done some kind of psycho-spiritual practice, and as you said, most of them have not woken up.
Right.
So kind of what advice would you give to them?
You got to refocus it, relook at stop trying to solve all your problems. Stop trying to make it about, if you want the truth. If you don't, then it's fine. Focus on your problems and try to be a better person and all that. So
or try to turn yourself into a superhuman. Or
superhuman, that's often one of the spiritual things too, that we're going to make a spiritual Superman.
Right.
But if you want the truth, the ultimate nature of reality, you've got to find out what you are. Otherwise, your illusory self is on a spiritual search. A search where it has no vested interest in finding the truth. Your illusory self has no interest in finding the truth because that's the end of it. You see what I mean? It has all of its vested interest in seeking the truth, not in discovering what it is. So that's why I would say that, again, the fundamental inquiry, the fundamental question, is really what am I? Really, really what it is. Right? That's the fundamental inquiry. And it's not complicated. It's a form of...
Well, that's why it's hard to do, because we want something that's complicated, right?
We want something that's complicated, and we keep making it complicated. Right. The mind wants something very spiritually sophisticated. That's why everywhere you go, the mind is falling in love with yet another spiritually sophisticated model of what this is all about and where it's all going, and, that's what the dream state is set up for, isn't it? Dreaming.
Well, like now there's a big emphasis on evolutionary spirituality and integral and lots of different people, and there's states and stages and phases and all that kind of stuff, and I guess for some people's mind it's nice to have that and to hold on to it and have something to play with.
Minds love that.
But probably for most people it ends up not really advancing the ball on, the track towards getting to the truth.
Well, this is why. It all may or may not be true, right? We'll just start from there. Any given person, do you know that it's true? Do you know that the model's true? Do you know? Would you bet your mother's, your father's, your wife, your children's, your cats, your dogs, and your life on it? Either you know with 100% certainty or you don't actually know. Do you know that it's true? You see, when we examine things in this way, I like to put it this way because it gets us out of the nonsense of the mind. When you put it like 100%, I know that it's true. Not I believe it's true, I want it to be true, I hope it's true. I know it is or I don't. It's black or white. Right? And when you see that, what most people start to realize is, almost everything that I think is true, I don't actually know. There's the crack. And then you discover this is what it's all about. Is the mind is terrified of facing the truth, which is it doesn't actually know. It's terrified of that. It will do anything to avoid I don't actually know. I don't know what this is about. I don't know where it's going. I don't know if evolutionary enlightenment is true or false. Maybe I would hope it to be. Maybe I'd love it to be. Maybe it all seems to be. But do I know? Do you see what I mean? And then you see the mind is using all of this to cover over uncertainty. And to me, that's what enlightenment is all about. It's about coming out of our trances. It's about no longer lying to ourselves. It's about, can I be totally honest with myself or can't I? If I can't, forget it. If I can, that's something else. Can I be honest? Do I know that this is true or not? And you see, when you see, I don't actually know. You see, you're back in a very innocent state, are you not? Very innocent. It might be for some people very uncomfortable. I'm not saying that those things aren't true. I'm just saying, can we get to the place where we can see that we don't know? Are we willing to do that? Because if we're not, forget about enlightenment. It ain't going to happen. Unless by some miracle accident. Which, it's always a miracle accident.
It happens every now and then.
Every now and then. Yeah, but seeing things as they are is the most potent catalyst. The most potent. Seeing things, even if it means that I actually don't know just about everything I think I do know. Even if that ends up being what's true. Because it's the truth that liberates, right? And it's not the truth we read in books or a spiritual teacher, not the truth that I say. Because I tell my students all the time, my teaching is not a theology, it's not a model, I'm not a pundit, I'm not a theology, I'm a spiritual teacher. Therefore, everything I say is a strategy to help awaken. It's not a coherent schematic of truth, because there isn't any such thing. Mm-hmm. It's a strategy to help people awaken,